Vernon Hall, Chapter 18. Christopher Vernon. I rummaged through Amelia's wardrobe for a white dress and eventually found a gown. It wasn't bridal attire, obviously. Poor Amelia had never been married. But for an impromptu and secret wedding with only two witnesses in a church and village I had never been to before, it was appropriate. Bertha shook her head gloomily all the while. When I had announced the news to her of my wedding, she had wept, but they weren't tears of joy, as I had expected from Bertha. Rather, they were tears of sorrow and dread. I do confess a heavy sensation sat in my heart. But this was the moment I had dreamt of since I saw Ezekiel, and my worst fear had been losing him. I had to marry him despite having apprehensions myself. "Shouldn't we at least consult the pastor, miss? I'm telling you, miss, you're making a blunder. Oh, please, miss, don't ruin your life," Bertha cried while I adorned myself in Amelia's white gown and wore her pearl brooch. "It's been decided now, Bertha. There is no turning back. Oh, Bertha, stop crying now and help me with my hair," I pleaded. I didn't want to be harsh to Bertha because deep down I knew she wasn't wrong. Bertha continued to snivel and mumble, but she transformed my disheveled hair into a beautiful bun. She then found a white chiffon cloth and attached it to my hair so that it resembled a veil. "You look lovely, miss," the kind woman exclaimed with tears running down her cheeks and her eyes sore and red from all the tears she had shed. She wiped her eyes and inquired, "Miss, have you thought of where you and Mr. Lloyd will live once you're married? Surely you cannot live in his cabin. Will he stay with you here at Vernon Hall?" Bertha's question was a valid one, and in truth I had no answer. Everything had been so sudden and unexpected. Ezekiel never discussed the details with me, and I had no strength to ask any questions, lest he lost his temper again. I shook my head, my emotions benumbed. "I don't really know, Bertha. I shall do as Ezekiel says, I suppose." Bertha and I waited in the drawing room for more than an hour. It felt like an eternity. There was a foreboding silence. The only sound was the grand clock on the wall ticking. Each second that passed presaged the arrival of something calamitous. Bertha anxiously fidgeted her pudgy hands, and doubts and apprehensions plagued my mind. We were both nervous and fearful of what was to come. I should have been glowing with happiness. It was, after all, my wedding day. Many memories, both joyful and sorrowful, of father and Amelia flashed. I suddenly remembered I hadn't taken Amelia's blessings. I told Bertha to wait for Ezekiel as I descended into the dungeon to see my guardian angel. As I looked in the casket, my heart fluttered with terror. Not only were Amelia's lips and eyes drooping as they had on previous occasions, but there were tears running down her cheeks. I could hear my heart pounding in the ominous silence. "Amelia, can you hear me?" I whispered. Obviously, there was no reply, but I felt her incorporeal presence there in that dungeon. I thought I heard her whisper to me. I saw the swirling mists again and heard a faint voice. "Don't, Eleanor, don't." Was I imagining this? I had been delusional since her death. I immediately knelt beside Amelia's body and prayed to the Almighty. "I am not perfect, God, but whatever I did it for Amelia. I did it because I loved her. The embalmment, not burying her body. I know that I transgressed your laws, but I had no choice. I thought she would suffer alone in an empty, horrible grave. I didn't know she would suffer more this way. Forgive me for whatever sins I may have committed. Forgive me for everything, but help me. Please, I beg of you, help me, for Amelia's sake." I wept, looking sorrowfully at my white gown. I heard noises from upstairs and assumed Ezekiel had arrived. I quickly wiped my tears, kissed Amelia's casket, and made my way upstairs. Ezekiel was dressed in a simple suit. He wore a rose in his jacket pocket. His silky hair was neatly combed, and he had shaved off his goatee. His face glowed evermore, as did his lustrous hazel eyes. There was no doubt that Ezekiel Lloyd resembled a fairy tale prince. He stared at me intently and then approached me. "You look beautiful, my darling," he exclaimed. I glanced at him, then at Bertha, who continued to sit on the sofa, oppressed by a wave of sadness. Her face was puffy and her gaze lowered to the floor. "Come, my love, I have arranged for a carriage. It is outside. Let us hurry to the church." He summoned Bertha, who rose and obeyed Ezekiel as mechanically and passively as I had. The tale then took a rather unexpected and sinister turn. We heard horses snorting and trotting. Another carriage had arrived. A moment later, we heard masculine voices. Bertha panicked. "Who is that, miss? Did you invite anybody else?" I shook my head perplexedly. Ezekiel glared at the door, his lips hard. His face fell into stern lines, and he bore a grave expression. My own thoughts were clamoring. "What's happening, Ezekiel?" I pleaded. "I don't know," he growled in indignation. The main door flung open, and in came Pastor Franklin, Gareth, Mr. Bartholomew, and another gentleman who wore a long grey coat and a tall hat. Pastor Franklin muttered curses under his breath. I was still as the men stood before me. Ezekiel continued to glare at them, and Bertha trembled from head to foot. What then ensued was a rather acrimonious dialogue between Pastor Franklin and myself. "What is the meaning of this, Pastor Franklin? You cannot just barge into my house," I said assertively. "No, Eleanor, I'm afraid I can. I can enter this house as your well-wisher, as Miss Vernon's well-wisher. You shunned me out once. I accepted it. But I cannot do so again. I cannot remain quiet when an act of crime is being committed," he shouted, glaring at Ezekiel. "An act of crime? I'm to be married, Pastor Franklin. Where is the crime in that?" "Who are you marrying, Eleanor? Do you really know who you are betrothed?" "You crossed the line, sir. It doesn't concern you who he is. I love him, and it is between me and—" The pastor interjected. "No, my dear. It is he who has crossed the line. You love him. I appreciate that. But does he really love you? Or is he marrying you so that he can take Vernon Hall away from you in due course?" I shook my head in disbelief. "Ezekiel loves me, Pastor Franklin. He is not marrying me for this property," I shouted, my anger spiraling out of control. Pastor Franklin cackled. This was the first time I had ever seen the pastor so incensed. "And he tells you his name is Ezekiel?" He approached Ezekiel and addressed him directly. "You are not well. You were never in your right mind. No wonder I never recognized you when I saw you in town some months ago. Your hair has grown longer and your features have matured." Ezekiel stood still as a waxwork and narrowed his eyes, gazing at the pastor cunningly. "Tell her who you are. Tell her," he shouted again. I turned to Ezekiel. "Ezekiel, say something, please. Tell them your name is Ezekiel and that you are Amelia's doctor." Pastor Franklin hit his head with his hand in indignation and shouted, "Doctor! For God's sake, man, if you won't tell your betrothed who you are, then I shall." The pastor gave Ezekiel another opportunity to defend himself, yet he didn't speak. "Very well. Eleanor, this man who claims to be Miss Vernon's doctor, this man who calls himself Ezekiel, is nothing more than an impostor. He is insane. This man is not Ezekiel Lloyd. My son has already told you who Ezekiel Lloyd was. Had my son not told me an hour ago about your secret lover and the fact he saw Miss Vernon and a man in the woodlands years ago, I would never have known. Mr. Bartholomew told me about this man's visit to his office some months ago, but I had no knowledge that he had ensnared you emotionally, pretending to be your knight in shining armor." I again shook my head and shouted desperately, "Will someone tell me the truth?" Gareth looked distraught. He took a step toward me, presumably to comfort me. But Mr. Bartholomew pulled his arm and motioned him to stop. Only I can tell you the truth, Eleanor, because Miss Vernon trusted me. She took me into confidence as well as Mr. Bartholomew. Eleanor, this man standing beside you, he is. He is Christopher Vernon, Miss Vernon's younger brother.